Fake news stories exploded online in this election season. In fact, BuzzFeed says in certain ways the fake stuff has become more prevalent than the actual real reporting. That site says the top 20 false election stories generated 8.7 million shares, reactions, and comments on Facebook. But the best performing real stories had about 15% less activity than the bogus stuff. Plus, BuzzFeed also says the vast majority of those fake stories are either pro-Trump or anti-Hillary. Here are a sample of the most popular ones. Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. Hillary ISIS email leaked, and it's worse than anyone could have imagined. Hillary is disqualified from holding federal office. And FBI agents suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide. All of the above untrue. Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have become the face of fake news, whether that's fair or not. Zuckerberg says they are now taking the problem seriously, and Facebook is taking measures, he says, to combat it. But Facebook is taking a whole lot of flack about this. This column in the Washington Post has an idea for the social media site. Its headline is, quote, "Call it a crazy idea, Facebook, but you need an executive editor." Here a portion of the column. What rules the roost at Facebook is engagement. To oversimplify, the more an item is shared among your friends, the more likely you are to see it. Clearly, that's not nearly enough. What is needed to kill fake news is ruthless fact-checking, gut-checking, and a big helping of common sense. The Silicon Valley behemoth, with its billion-plus users, is a major news source. For some demographic groups, the leading one. Its influence is only going in one direction, ever upward. Well, Margaret Sullivan, she wrote that piece. She is the Post media columnist, and she's kind enough to join us for a few minutes. Thank you, Margaret.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Now, there's been a 180 here, and a pretty rapid one, from Mr. Zuckerberg a couple days after it, when pressed on the ubiquitous number of stories of fake news. He scoffed at the idea and said basically it had a negligible, if any, impact. Now he seems to be singing a different tune. Is it fair to say that everybody acknowledges this is not only real, but it had a real impact on what happened a couple weeks ago?
Well, I don't think we have proof of how it impacted the election, but I think that when this many people are misinformed, it's not a crazy idea to think that it might have had an effect, especially since so much of it was coming from one direction. It was much more anti-Clinton than it was anti-Trump. So, you know, I don't have any numbers to back that up, but I think that whether we can track the election results back to it or not, the proliferation of fake news is not a good thing and really needs to be taken more seriously.
And there was something else at play, Margaret, in that, sure, we've always had the Inquirers and the rest, and social media relatively new, at least as it relates to campaign politics, but you had the candidate in question or his supporters, I'm talking about Trump, that were advancing this, whether they were retweeting it, whether they were even talking about it open loud on microphones at rallies. This wasn't just done in the basement of somebody. This was being propagated by the candidate himself.
That's right. I mean, it could go very quickly from, you know, an idea that somebody had or something that somebody put on a blog, and before you know it, and it wouldn't take very long, it could become a tweet from the candidate himself, now the president-elect. So it's a really fast cycle, and it's very hard to stamp it out once it gets going, once people start sharing it, which is why I say that I think Facebook needs to hire an editor who can exert some editorial control over whether these things just get propagated so quickly. And, you know, some people have responded by saying, oh, you know, that's terrible, it's censorship. I'm not looking for censorship, just for good judgment.
What about the counter-argument that Zuckerberg originally made, or those supporters, and he seems to be backing off, which is, hey, our job, we're not journalists here. We're just creating the platform, and people are going to share what they want. We don't want to modify or fact-check people's information. Let the basic audience be the, you know, consumer here, and if they choose to inform themselves one way or the other, that's up to them.
Right. You know, I understand that argument, but I think that because Facebook has become so incredibly influential and has become such an important source of news, that they need to take their public responsibility seriously in a way that they haven't before. And this is, you know, we're seeing other social media platforms wrestle with this too. Twitter, for example, has taken down a lot of terrorist-related accounts. This is a sort of a different problem, but you know, equally or perhaps more worrisome.
And isn't it a little bit of a false narrative, Margaret, that when they say, hey, listen, we can't do anything about this, it's too big, it's too fast moving. You gave one example as it relates to people who are promoting terroristic ideas, but also if there's child pornography or immediately that stuff will be efforted to be taken down. It seems that they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Right. You know, Facebook has what they call community standards, and it's a kind of vaguely worded, you know, here's what's acceptable, here's what's not acceptable. But it ends up making, those standards end up making some really dubious decisions, if you can talk about standards or algorithms making decisions. But, you know, for example, a really famous, iconic photograph from the Vietnam War was removed from Facebook because it was seen as child pornography. Well, that's about as far from child pornography as you can get. But according to Facebook's standards, and with no judgment applied, it was seen as child pornography and deleted. So it's not just about taking things away, it's also about not taking things away that actually should be allowed to be there.
I've argued that there's a unintended consequence with all of this as well. By not knowing what's real or not, when there is real journalism and serious, it gets discounted sometimes by some as almost as if it gets washed up in some of the phony stories that'll come out there. I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to where they say, oh, that's just some made-up piece about Trump and charities, et cetera. And I'm like, no. Farnhold, this is real reporting here. You know, it happens. Yeah. You know, they all get put in the same bucket.
Right, exactly. I mean, and I've heard the argument that, you know, more good journalism will overcome all this bad, all these lies. And actually, I wish that were true, but I don't think it is, because it's really the fake stuff and the lies that are drowning out the worthwhile and good stuff. So I think some judgment needs to be applied here, and some, you know, some common sense, really. Which is what editors can do.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, whether it is an executive editor or something akin to it, do you think these major sites will go in this direction, or do they think it's going to be more headaches than it's worth?
Well, I do think they are concerned, and they have valid concerns about just the sheer scale of Facebook, which has more than 1 billion users, you know, and it's global. So how do you deal with this across the entire, you know, world? It is really tough. You know, my idea is really, in a way, to get people thinking about this. You know, could this be a help? Could there be someone who could help make some of these judgments? Not that it's going to be someone who's going to read every Facebook post in every language. That's just not possible. So, but I do think that it's encouraging that Mark Zuckerberg is taking it a little more seriously now, and perhaps this will be one idea that could be considered.
We shall see. Margaret, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, let's bring it to our panel right now. Former Democratic New Jersey Congressman Steve Rothman and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All right, first off, in the beginning, I thought, oh, this is like the Inquirer. How many people is this really going to impact? Just the people who want to believe in the tin hat stuff. Then I saw the numbers. And on Facebook, and we know how the demos work here, especially for millennials, there were more consumers of fake news than real news. And by real news, I mean the top 20 newspapers that are out there. More of the stories that were made up and declaratively false were consumed than the real hard stuff. That's petrifying.
It is worth paying attention to see if it represents anything. We don't know if all those consumers of that fake news then went out and voted according to the fake news. But as you referred to, the National Enquirer, I remember before the internet days, you were at the supermarket, you passed the National Enquirer, the Sun, the Globe.
And you always wonder who believes or who buys that stuff, but they did.
Outrageous things about space aliens coming in, et cetera, et cetera. And people were entertained by it, but they didn't act upon it. One of the good pieces of news about the internet, once we consider the bad news, is that this fake news can proliferate on the internet, is that to find a diversity of opinion about any subject only requires a touch of a button.
Except that's created,
And
in
one
my
other thing.
eyes, though, alternate realities, Andrew. And to that end, two things were a little bit different this time around. One was you had one candidate who trafficked in it. Okay, more than just, hey, it's out there, whatever myths they're going to do. He trafficked on it, used it, passed around, and if it was ever disproven, never even acknowledged it. But the other thing that at least to me was really striking was that this was permitted for as long as it was. But my point is, if we said something, we get in trouble. There's things like libel and slander, depending on print or TV, that you have to deal with. They said, yeah, well, it's people's public opinions. They can say whatever they want, but then they're basically promulgating and putting it out there.
Yeah, except I think I'm in the camp that's like, this is really on voters to sort of find.
But how are they supposed to know it's true or not?
They're supposed to do their own research, and they're supposed to look for different sources, and they're supposed to look for the confirmation of a bombshell story like the ones that you saw got all those hits from a reputable news source.
Why though? And that's not
Because
fair,
that's-
Andrew.
because
We
that's
do
the-
this for a
because
living.
that's the
How are
way-
they to believe that the Pope really
Because
didn't
that's
endorse
the way
it?
it works. Because you don't believe every ad that you see on television. You don't believe every ad that you see in print. You don't believe every flyer that's sent to your mailbox.
No, but if,
you-
whoa. But if Andrew, a major auto manufacturer, says that their car gets X miles to a gallon and it's proven to be false, there's a lawsuit. People have a right. They've been sold a false bill of goods and it's false advertising. You get in major trouble for that.
But I got to tell you, in the majority of our country's history, there was no such recourse. There wasn't consumer protection. That only happened in the 60s and 70s.
You're with me. It's a good thing, right?
It's a very good thing. But we need to have some patience, although I appreciate your impatience with fake news stories. But I do agree with Andrew. It is on the consumer to follow up to see if that claim on TV where they say not certified by the FDA, but take this and it'll cure every physical pain you ever had, they need to look into it.
I can't say that somebody was convicted, was arrested and convicted of a crime that never was. I face legal exposure for that. They're saying that someone committed heinous crimes and were involved in X, Y, and Z, and they permitted it and profited from it. They monetize the fact that people are clicking on it. Now, obviously, they can do something about it because Facebook is saying they can't. And moreover, as I said with my guest, they don't permit people to traffic in child pornography. They don't
Right.
allow people to do that. So
there-
why do they let lies
So
permit?
you don't let people scream fire in a crowded theater or engage in child pornography, although some weirdos, in my opinion, have called them free speech. But there is a line. So the question is, we want, as the founders said, a marketplace of ideas, where ideas are evaluated on whether they ring true
But it's not
or
opinion.
they
These are
are
stated as
true.
fact.
Well,
But that, to me, that's a distinction with a difference, Steve. What it is, and I take issue, Andrew, and only this, that we're taking the consumer and now we're making it incumbent on them to believe or not believe anything. If the New York Times put on their front page the story about X, Y, or Z, and it was proven to be false, and they used recklessness or malice in telling the story, there'd be a lawsuit, and they've been sued before.
Mm-hmm. But
There's a different standard applied now, even though it's a different platform. And to me, people are obviously using it and shaping their opinions.
Well, there's some problems, I think, with the process in all of this. Look, the New York Times has a reputation and an established history, whereas, Blogspot 37, Make America Great Again, has no history. You want to believe the stuff that they're saying? That's on you. You're the one who's closing your eyes to the reality of it and not doing the research for something else.
I'm talking about Facebook,
The
Andrew.
other thing is, on
But I'm
Facebook,
talking about Facebook. Why are you
on
just-
Facebook, you want to have, like, if the Clinton campaign wanted to sue whoever was writing those stories that were false, they're entitled to do that. But what are you supposed to do? Sue the 900,000 people who retweeted it or who reposted it?
But Rich,
They're
there's
not-
then
a
where's-
Supreme Court case on the subject, New York Times versus Sullivan, that if you're a public figure, the bar for declaring that statement to be unconstitutional or worthy of criminal prosecution or censorship is very high if you're a public figure. Now, I'm not endorsing false stories where they make up false facts, but there are things like PolitiFact or fact-check websites.
But
So there
people-
is a burden. But
but
let
don't
me
move
agree
on,
with
don't
you.
move on past that.
Let me
because-
agree with
no,
you.
but don't
Let me
move on
agree.
past that because I've heard that before. And to me, it's a canard because nobody checks what PolitiFact ends up
That's
proving
not
or
true.
not.
Lots
You,
of us
me, and
do.
him look at. But the 900,000 people who believe that Pope Francis endorsed Trump, they're not going to PolitiFact to find if it's true or not.
It's one of the balancing acts in our democratic experiment called America is freedom of speech. So yes, we need to have fact checking, and we need people to call out these things. And if there are algorithms, like the Facebook founder says, that he can insert to get rid of unfactual things, great. But when there is a borderline question, we like to give the benefit of the doubt to freedom of speech
You're
and
not going to
expression.
find me to be a
Who would
opponent
you
of free
like-
speech, but that's not what this.
Who would you like to be the arbiter of what's true and what's not
What did
true
you just
on
say?
Facebook?
Assign a public editor.
For Facebook? So that Facebook is going to go through how many millions of posts? How many hundreds of millions of posts do they go
First of
through
all,
every
it's
single
not
day?
for every single story. It's the ones that get major traffic here to find out if they're verifiable or not. And my problem with all this is people who want to, it was like my only issue that I ever took with The Daily Show, which I loved, which is they want to be taken seriously. And then the first time somebody looks at them, they say, oh, we're just a comedy show. You are what you pretend to be. For Facebook, they know that people in their 20s consume that more than any other source for news. So if you're going to create a platform where you're going to say, come here, consume this information to be informed, and then you turn around, throw your arms up and say, oh, well, it's not really up to know what's real or not.
I have a question for you. Let's say somebody goes out to the public square and says Richard French is really
Happened yesterday. No.
is really 10 feet tall. You are figuratively, but not literally 10 feet tall. That is factually
No harm. No harm was done.
Oh, what if they called you 1 foot tall?
If they called me an anti-Semite, or they said that I was a Nazi, and that it was I can go after them, and I very well may choose to, and say that I've been slandered here. Now, whether I choose to go down that or not, that's my own thing. But if they've harmed my reputation with a falsehood,
the bar to that kind of a lawsuit is very high, as I mentioned, because of the existing and long-established
But here's
First
the difference.
Amendment law.
Somebody standing in
New
a town
York
square
Times
versus using
Sullivan.
a digital town hall to do that. That there is a difference between both reach and also now you're bringing in a third party here to put information that I've always found this extremely weak to turn around and say, it's not my job to say what's true or not. If they purported a lie here with it, they said that a particular race or ethnicity was responsible for some heinous thing, and it spread like wildfire, and that people were harmed as a consequence because that created fear, would we still be saying to ourselves, oh, well, you know, it's not their job? Sure it is. They don't have to stop everything, but they at least have to make a full faith effort. And right now, to this point at least, they've made no effort. Now, it seems like they're going to try to. And my contention all along has been, if you want to, you can make major inroads. Consciously, they've chosen not to, because once you open that door, now there's expectations of you. We'll see how it flows, but I think this is long overdue for Facebook. I'm not so sure the table agrees. All right, coming up next. After Hillary Clinton's devastating loss, the question is it time for the Democratic Party to change course and also change its congressional leadership? Mr. Rothman, I'm sure, has an opinion as to whether his old boss ought to keep her job or not, or who'd be better tasked here or equipped to take over after a devastating November.